Hey everyone, this is Ipsha from Team IFPD. For today's session, we have with us Dr. Rajat Ganguly, Professor, Murdoch University, Australia, who's an acknowledged expert in the field of international relations. Dr. Ganguly is widely published in the areas of ethnic conflict, insurgency and terrorism, conflict development and security, conflict management and peace building, foreign policy analysis, democracy, human rights, good governance, and South Asian politics. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs and has published numerous books and monographs. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Ganguly. We're glad you could join us today. So without wasting further time, let's begin the show. I'll kindly request Tanya Mittal, Head Policy and Planning IFPD, to take over.
With that enthusiastic introduction, so we're very happy and very glad to have you on board. We'll dive straight into brass tacks, if you don't mind. Okay. We know that you come with worlds of experience, especially in the areas of study of international relations, strategic studies, and geopolitics. For the audience that's tuning in today, I think a lot of people are interested to know a little more about conflict transformation, conflict and peace building. So personally, if you can share some insights on ethnic complexities when it comes to conflicts. Do you think it's a persistent issue globally? Do you see this as an issue specifically in some areas of the world? And if that's the case, could you narrate a couple of instances from across the globe?
Okay. That's a fairly broad question, Tanya, and thanks for asking that. Ethnic conflict is a reality in international relations simply because most of the nation states in this world are not nation states in the real sense. They are multinational states or multi-ethnic states. And you have this, this model in front of you in many states where there is in many cases, a numerical majority in an ethnic sense, but also surrounded by significant minorities. So this majority-minority question, ethnic relations between communities, questions of power sharing, questions of who gets how much, particularly if those are decided along ethnic lines, etc. I mean, those are the context in which you find ethnic politics. And oftentimes, conflict is basically politics done through other means. I mean, generally, politics is, particularly international politics. I mean, we say that international relations is mostly done through diplomacy. But then sometimes diplomacy doesn't work for whatever reason. And then nation states often have the option of going to war, in which case, they use the military instrument as a form of, their policy, trying to achieve whatever policy objectives they have. And which is why I think it's understood that even war, which is basically conducting politics through military means, war is politics by other means. It is the normal means is in a domestic setup, I guess you could argue that the normal way of doing politics is through elections, through parliamentary debates, through decisions made by the government, etc. But sometimes that model, which is the normal way of thinking of politics, if it doesn't get you the kind of results that you are looking for, oftentimes you will find movements emerging, agitations forming. Sometimes these have ethnic dimensions, and this can then even lead to violence. So the option of violence in politics becomes a viable option when somebody makes the calculation, whether it's an ethnic group, whether it is some leaders, some platforms. They make the calculation that if they use the instrument of violence, they are likely to get more compared to if they did not use the option of violence or the instrument of violence. To understand this, actually, you don't have to go very far from India. I mean, if you look at Sri Lanka, this Tamil Sinhalese ethnic conflict that happened in Sri Lanka, it started, one could argue, even before Sri Lanka got independence in 1948. The issues were all there. The issues were very much there in the 1950s and in the 1960s. But the Tamil protest, Tamil agitation, Tamil politics, the way it was done was very different. It was done mostly through constitutional means. It was agitational politics, but non-violent agitational politics. All of that changed in the 1970s with the formation of these insurgent organizations. Many were formed. The group that probably most people have heard of is the Tamil Tigers, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LCTU. They were created in 1973 and then, as the new Tamil Tigers, and then changed their name to the LTT in 1976. So these were mostly younger generation of Tamils. They had witnessed the ethnic, relationship, the confrontational politics in the 50s and 60s. They were now of college-going age, and they had given up on that brand of politics simply because that brand of politics has not achieved anything. So the argument was that, if we follow in the footsteps of our father's generation, we are not likely to get anything more than what they have got, and they basically achieve nothing. So we have to use other means, other instruments, and that's when the violent option came in. That's when an armed insurgency started. That's when the military training started. That's when the weapons came in. That's when the terrorist attacks started. So the context is still the same. It's just the instrument or the means are different. And in which country, what means will be applied depends on who's involved, what's at stake, how do they see this, etc. And sometimes individual leaders, their own value judgments often becomes a factor. To give you an example, when Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, after apartheid was finished in that country, it is now fairly well known that there were a significant number of senior people within the African National Congress who wanted some form of retribution on the white population, revenge for all the wrongs that had been done in the past. And it was a very natural, reaction that, this is what they had done to us. We are now in power. We can unleash, a campaign of violence on them. And some senior people probably wanted that. And Nelson Mandela alone probably stood in front of it to say that, I'm not going to sanction that. And if you want me as your president, then you will have to accept the way I want to do things. So I'm not going to take the violent route. Rather, what we will do is, in South Africa, they had this very unique thing called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where they didn't drive away all the atrocities under the carpet, but they actually addressed that with the people who actually perpetrated the violence. And the whole focus of this was on getting some form of retributive justice. That we are interested in achieving justice. We are interested in achieving closure. We are not interested in creating another river of blood. We have had enough blood already shed in this country. And Mandela's own value judgments, his own personality, these came into play. But next door to South Africa, in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe was a very different leader. And he and his party sanctioned, a pogrom of violence against white settlers in the name of correcting the mistakes of, Zimbabwe's or Rhodesia's very notorious, colonial past. And Robert Mugabe didn't have a problem with that. So individual leaders, in this case, Mandela and Mugabe, they were the difference. And their parties, their followers followed them. So ethnic conflict is almost in any part of the world. I don't think there is any part of the world which is free of any ethnic problems or ethnic relations. And it comes from the basic fact that most countries are multi-ethnic or multinational. And within that context, within that setting, you have, all these questions that come up. your numerical strength becomes an issue. Sometimes, the way power is distributed in a society, the structure of the society, individual leaders who are leading these groups, all of this oftentimes play a big role in deciding the outcome. And in Sri Lanka's case, you had a 30-year-long armed insurgency, primarily because from the 1970s onwards, a group of Sri Lankan Tamils gave up on peaceful agitation. And not only that, one of the notorious aspects of the LTT was that it did not allow anybody else to speak on behalf of the Tamils. So if anybody wanted to speak on behalf of the Tamils, they were eliminated by the LTT. So, this, not only that we are going to do this in a military way, we are very clear about wanting a separate Tamil country, but we also want it under our control, our authoritarian control, and no dissent is allowed. Nobody is allowed to question that. And if you stood up and questioned that, they would come after you. So I'm not saying this will happen in every country, but what I'm saying is that, to understand ethnic politics, you have to understand certain basic parameters, and then within that, these things happen.
That's absolutely true, sir. In fact, the one point I could make complete note of, that how conflict is absolutely ridden with politics and violence. And with that being said, nowadays when you pick up any newspaper, any YouTube channel, any kind of news reporting, it's all filled with news coming in from the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Perhaps I might want to ask you, what are your opinions on a conflict like this? Do you think any kind of conflict escalation, de-escalation strategies would work at this point of time?
Look, my opinion is simply my own personal view. This is a very, very complicated conflict, as you know. It has been going on for ages without, finding a resolution. My own personal opinion is that any terrorist attack, where whatever the cause might be, the cause might be a very justified cause. You may have very good reasons to be angry. But my own view is that it should not authorize you or legitimize you into choosing not only a violent path, but a violent path where you deliberately start killing civilians. And therefore, in this particular instance, there has been argument saying that Israel has been systematically creating massive problems for Palestinians, and therefore this anger then came out into the surface, etc., etc. And those who make that argument probably have reasons to make that argument. My view is that initial attack, which led to the killing of over 1,000 Israeli civilians, mostly civilians, mostly people who had nothing to do with government decisions. This was problematic for me to understand and accept. But then comes the other question that, okay, now how do you fight a group like this who are, deeply enmeshed within a civilian structure? Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas, as you know. And those who know Hamas, those who know the situation in Gaza, they all pretty much agree, irrespective of religion, that Hamas uses, civilian buildings, schools, hospitals to launch attacks, to store weapons, use them as their offices, and so on and so forth. And those then become, if the Israelis come to know that this is the building from where rockets were fired, then, those become military targets. And whether Israel then should fire into that building or not, I'm not qualified to answer, because it depends on who's running Israel, what their thinking is, etc. But if the decision has been made by Israel that we need to finish Hamas as an insurgent movement, and this insurgency is very, very deeply enmeshed within a civilian structure, then how do you do that without causing civilian suffering, civilian death? I don't think anybody knows. The other question that has come up in this regard is, maybe Israel shouldn't invade Gaza, shouldn't do this. Maybe they should, tolerate Hamas, have a exchange of prisoners. There are 200 supposedly Israeli prisoners with Hamas, and there are Palestinians in Israeli jails. So, one idea that I have heard is that prisoners should be swapped, and then, let tempers come down. Then perhaps, put pressure on the Palestinian Authority to put pressure on Hamas, other countries to put pressure on Hamas. Whether Israel would take that option, I don't know. I'm not a decision maker. I'm not privy to their, internal conversations. But my concern is basically twofold. One is that any ground invasion of Gaza, which does not allow civilians to escape into a neutral territory, would probably end up killing a lot of civilians who would either be used as human shields by Hamas, or they would die in the crossfire, or if those civilians are in buildings which are occupied by Hamas, and Israel wants to kill Hamas without waiting for those civilians to leave, then civilians will die. We saw a very similar situation during the final days of the war in Sri Lanka. You may remember that it was reported that hundreds of thousands of Tamil civilians were held hostage either by the LTTE, or they were cut down by government forces who were trying to reach the LTTE, because the LTTE was more and more pushed into a pocket from where they could not escape. And this is how the government was able to kill them. The military was able to kill all the leaders. But to get to the LTTE, they had to go through the civilian population. And this is where the story of that final war becomes very murky. There's a infamous video of Channel 4, BBC Channel 4, I think, which talks about willful war crimes committed by the Sri Lankan military. It became a big issue in the UN Human Rights Council as well. There are already, I think, I'm hearing calls from various quarters which basically says that Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza. But then the bigger question is, how do you fight an urban insurgency, which is so ruthless, which does not, give a thought about civilian lives themselves, but then goes and hides within civilians, knowing fully well that to get to them, you'll have to kill civilians. Does it mean that, you will always be on the back foot with groups like this? Number one. Number two, the other thing which has not been talked about in a great length, I think, if you actually go and look at the Hamas website, or if you look at the Hezbollah website, or even if you look at the official policy of the Iranian government, these organizations or even the Iranian government, they're very clear that we want complete destruction of Israel. So if you are fighting an enemy that basically wants your death, your complete destruction, how do you then in good faith negotiate with that enemy? That is also a question that a lot of people need to ask. That how do I trust that enemy? That enemy which officially, openly says that I actually, will not, leave any stone unturned in order to kill you. How do you then imagine yourself, getting into a deal with that enemy and have this belief that that deal will be honored by the enemy? The deal will never be honored by the enemy as long as the enemy believes that, it is only your death which will lead to victory. And Hamas says that very openly, Hezbollah says that very openly, and so does the Iranian regime. So in my way of looking at it, I sometimes feel that Israel has got a big problem, that in the sense that it actually cannot trust the Hamas. It cannot trust the Palestinian Authority, who are basically mouthing the same thing as Hamas. And the same story with Hezbollah or with Islamic Jihad or with the Iranian government. And Israeli leaders, can you blame them if they say that, we cannot trust these people because they actually believe that we should be completely killed, we should be completely annihilated. There should not be any Jewish state. So all of a sudden, now that people are saying, oh, we should have a two-state formula, this, that. Even if you have a two-state formula, would that guarantee Israel's security forever? Knowing fully well that these groups believe in their mind that Israel's destruction has to be done, completely wiped out. All Jews need to be killed. I mean, if you are publicly saying that, and your website is saying it, I'm not making it up, I mean, you yourself are saying it, then how do you expect Israel to take a softer approach towards you? I mean, that's it's almost a contradiction, isn't it? That you stand for Israel's destruction, Israel's death, and you expect Israel to be nice to you, Israel to be understanding about you. When 1,300 Jews or whatever were killed, all these, all these celebrations all over the world, that Israelis have been killed. I mean, in Australia, in Sydney, they took out a massive procession in front of the Opera House, chanting, gas the Jews, kill the Jews. I'm not saying that these people are not angry, they can celebrate anything. But what I'm saying is, as an impartial observer, if you believe that this is what these people are saying, this is what these people are doing, and then Israel to be sympathetic towards them or take a softer approach towards them, and if they don't, you say, oh, Israel is very nasty. I have a hard time actually accepting that kind of logic, because for Israel to be a little bit softer or a little bit kinder, it needs to be reassured that people are condemning what Hamas has done and not celebrating the death of over 1,000 Jewish people, some of them babies, some of them very elderly, and rejoicing in that. Then turning around and saying, okay, but on the other hand, you have to be nice to us. You have to be, you can't do this, you can't do that, and you'd have to allow, you have to listen to Hamas, or have swapping of prisoners with Hamas, or you have to give the Palestinians a separate state, etc., etc. And you expect Israelis to actually accept that, to believe that, to trust you on that. Why should they trust you? So I think that's where the problem is. That there's no trust between the two sides, because when you frame the conflict as a zero-sum conflict, saying either there will be a total Palestinian state or there will be a Jewish state, we are not. So in that sense, when you are saying that we want complete destruction of Israel, complete annihilation of Israel, you're basically then saying, we don't believe actually in a two-state theory. I mean, even if we have West Bank and Gaza as a Palestinian state, what is the guarantee that state, which Israel will now say, okay, you can have, will not harm Israel? So my way of looking at it is that if the Iranian government were to come and say, we have changed our mind, we can coexist with this. We don't have to be friends with Israel, but we don't stand for the destruction of Israel. Or if Hezbollah were to say that, or Hamas were to say that, then perhaps gradually you can build trust. Look, I mean, common sense tells you that before any meaningful negotiation happens, you have to have trust between the adversaries. If the adversaries don't trust each other, then the question that will always rise in negotiation is, whatever deal we are signing today, how do we know that this is going to be honored tomorrow? This was exactly the problem even in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had 6 rounds of peace talks in the early 2000s between the LTT and the government. And the consensus after the 6th round was that the LTT is using these peace talks to actually put in place a Tamil state in the northern province and the eastern province. And we can't have that. They are deliberately entering into discussions to buy time, and they are utilizing this time to actually consolidate a Tamil state, which is against the spirit of the negotiations. So there was no trust at the end of the day, and this is what Sri Lankan hardliners told the government, that you are barking up the wrong tree. Prabhakaran is not interested in a peaceful solution. He is steadfast that he's going to have a Tamil state. Nothing short of that will satisfy him. So therefore, you have no option but to seek the complete destruction of the LTTE. And I have a feeling that people in Israel are thinking like that within the government, that we can't trust Hamas. We can't trust the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority will deal with later on. But with Hamas, we have to get this finished once and for all. Now, what is the price we are going to pay for that? Have they done any calculation? Is there any thinking that, if we have to kill, let's say, 100,000 Palestinian civilians to destroy Hamas, are we willing to do that? Those are difficult questions that only the Israeli leadership can answer. I can't answer. But Israel one thing everybody I think should understand, that being after all, a liberal democracy in some senses, Israel is saying to the Palestinian people that, you should move south because we are going to invade from the north. So we don't want you there. But if people are not leaving, then we need to ask, why are they not leaving? Is it because Hamas is threatening them that you cannot leave? I want you as almost a shield between me and the advancing Israeli forces. Because the civilians then become a bargaining chip. So it's a tough decision for leadership at that point. But I have a feeling that Netanyahu and his war cabinet, they are probably thinking that we cannot let Hamas get away with this. We have to destroy this. If we destroy Hamas, let's say hypothetically, if they destroy Hamas, militarily at least, then this will fundamentally change the politics within the Palestinian group. I mean, one fact which hasn't been reported very widely, in my judgment, is that Hamas came to power through elections in 2006 in Gaza. They haven't held an election after that. So they have been in power for 17 years without any election. Same story with the Palestinian Authority. That when Palestinian Authority came to power, they haven't held any elections after that. These millions or billions of dollars that have been pumped into Gaza and West Bank, where that money has disappeared, nobody knows. Nobody has ever given any accounts saying, this is. And the other story is that when it comes to Gaza, it is a fact that Israel provides free electricity, free water, etc. So here is a country that is providing you public service or public goods for free, and in return you say, I'm for the total destruction of the country. How many countries would accept that? I mean, would people, if there is a group in India which stands up and says, we want complete destruction of India, are we going to be very nice to them? Do you think we are tolerant enough to accept that? I mean, that's my question, So I have more questions rather than answers on this.
Absolutely, sir. Actually, you rightly pointed out how civilian death toll has shockingly gone up, especially in the current conflict. A similar resurgence of civilian killings has been seen under the Taliban rule in Afghanistan. Do you think there is a similar challenge in that country, in the region? Is it to do with the current conflict, or are there any other factors here that you can outline for us?
If you look at the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, Taliban was very clear that anybody that they considered as collaborator with the Americans or with the previous government, they had to be eliminated. There was no mercy shown. There were summary executions. They had list of names. They went after people. My information is some of the Afghan security forces people who surrendered to the Taliban, some of the officer level people who surrendered to the Taliban were executed by the Taliban because their loyalty was questioned. Many ran away into neighboring countries. So Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, some Afghan units basically crossed the border into these countries, neighboring countries, and sought asylum. Many people left Afghanistan with the Americans, when the Americans were getting people out. So quite a few people left. I think the Americans were aware of the problem that people who worked for them or who had helped them in whatever ways, even as interpreters or government clerks or whatever. I mean, their lives were at risk under Taliban because the Taliban would show no mercy. And Taliban has not shown any mercy towards women. They have not shown any mercy towards people that they suspected of loyalty. That these people are not going to help the Taliban or not going to support the Taliban. And we didn't make a huge hue and cry simply because it was in Afghanistan. And a lot of people, if you look at the journalists, for example, some journalists talked about it for a while and then they forgot about it. And the Taliban has been going on for 2 years without anybody recognizing the Taliban. Most of the Afghan money that is in American banks have not been unfrozen, not been released. And things are ticking along in Afghanistan. I mean, one good thing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, my information is that the Taliban did criticize the Hamas. They did say that what Hamas did was not right, and we are not going to go and join this fight because Hamas is trying to make this into an Arab or Muslim world versus Israel fight. So Taliban categorically said, we are not involved in this. We are not interested in this. Our goal is Afghanistan, and that's where we want to be. And I think they have become smarter compared to the last time they were in power. They have realized that they need to consolidate their rule, and they cannot upset all these big countries. So probably wise enough to make that decision. Unfortunately, I think if you look at the Islamic countries, then for me the more problematic position comes from states like Iran, Turkey, and to some extent Iraq and Qatar. These are the problematic states in my judgment. I think I wouldn't rule out the fact that this attack happened at a time when there were rumors of a impending rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And as soon as this attack happened and then Israel started hitting back in the Gaza, Saudi Arabia basically said that any rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia is now in deep freeze. We are moving away from that. So Islamic world politics, I think, probably had something to do with this. The signaling to Hamas, and Hamas could not have done this on their own, is my judgment. I think Hamas was told to do this. From what we are hearing, that this was probably well planned, and it was in the planning stages for almost 2 years. But the go ahead, the timing was saying, do it now. My sense is that this has got to do with Middle East politics, particularly politics between the Saudi Sunni empire. The Sunni world is led by Saudi Arabia, as you know, and the Shia empire led by Iran. So Iran-Saudi Arabian politics for strategic dominance in the Middle East, I think, has a lot to do with this. Iran has been a staunch supporter of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. Iran, provided a lot of support to Islamic Jihad, and Iran is a big supporter of the Assad regime in Syria, for example. So Iranian influence clearly in the Middle East has grown, and after the disastrous invasion of Iraq by the US, which effectively handed power to the Shias in Iraq, Iranian influence in Iraq has also grown. So Iraq and Iran are now both controlled by Shias. Iran is a Shia state to begin with, but then Iraq under Saddam Hussein was at least controlled by the Sunnis. No longer. It is now controlled by the Shias. So Shia power, which is in Islam, you have this binary division between Sunnis and Shias, mainly. And there's always been tussle between the Sunnis and the Shias. And in this tussle, if you look at the last sort of 20, 25 years, the Iranian seems to be gaining a lot of influence and a lot of clout within the Middle East. And the other very interesting equation, of course, is Erdogan and Turkey. That Erdogan now wants to replace Saudi Arabia as the main Sunni power in the Islamic world. Some say that he has this grandiose vision in his mind that he will resurrect the Ottoman Empire and he will declare himself as the Caliph of an Islamic caliphate, which effectively is what he wants. And Erdogan, you can go and look at some of his speeches from the past. He openly talks about Muslims coming to reconquer Europe, which is probably something that is happening in front of our eyes, piece by piece. So very interesting set of moves on the chessboard of power politics, geopolitics.
Absolutely interesting, sir. I wanted to, on a very parting note now, request you if you could help us understand any mediation processes in this entire spectrum of conflict transformation and peace building.
Look, my own sense is that there are two big reasons why adversaries agree to some kind of a mediated solution to a conflict. One is if you have basically a parity of military power, which means a balance of power. So when you have a balance of power, logic dictates that there is no point in fighting on anymore because you're not going to gain anything substantial because the two powers are roughly balanced. So when you reach a parity of power on the battlefield, that's when we argue logically it makes sense to make peace. And ironically, it is the imbalance of military power on the battlefield which may prolong a conflict, because the guys who are winning, those who are on the up, they would not want to stop the war because they think we have the military advantage, so if we keep fighting, we are going to get more. And those who are at the bottom, those who are the weaker side, they would say, we don't want to stop now because if we stop now, we will get a horrible deal. And this would, seal our fate forever, perhaps. So what we should do is we should try and hold on and try and get support from outside so that we can gradually, change the course of the war in our favor and reach some kind of a parity so that we can then sign a more equitable agreement. So the first condition is a balance of power. So if you have a balance of power, you are more likely to get a positive outcome through negotiation. If there is an imbalance, one could argue that logic tells you that both the stronger side and the weaker side would have less reason to come to a settlement. They would have more reasons to want to fight on. So that's point number one. Point number two, of course, is that in any negotiation, for negotiations to actually produce results, two other things are important. One is if there is trust between the adversaries, that I can trust you, you can trust me, we can agree to some kind of an agreement, and there are enough mechanisms to give me the confidence that you will abide by that agreement, and you would have the same confidence that I would abide by that agreement. If that confidence is not there, then chances are we will struggle to get an agreement done in the first place. And even if we have the agreement, there will always be the suspicion that we are going to cheat. You are going to violate the agreement, or I will violate the agreement. And I will assume that you will violate the agreement. So therefore, I wouldn't want to be caught napping. So therefore, I would also violate the agreement. And in many conflict situations, you get that. A peace was signed, but then both sides violated it and they were back to war. Which is why I think getting a third party involved to act as a guarantor, saying, I stand as a guarantor, that you can sign this deal and I will make sure that there is no cheating, there is no going back, that you can, through my good offices, you can implement this agreement. So this implementation question, can I trust you to implement it? Can you trust me to implement it? Can we act in good faith towards each other? And this is a very complicated thing. It's not an easy thing. It requires diplomacy. It requires, all kinds of checks and balances. Sometimes even foreign powers to be acting as a third-party guarantor, etc., etc. But it comes down also to this question of battle fatigue. There are cases where an adversary, a war has been fought for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and both sides are exhausted. And being exhausted, they realize that if we keep on going down this war path, we are both going to be destroyed. So therefore, it might make sense for the moment to stop fighting. So classic example was the Iran-Iraq war, which started in 1980. By 1988, after 8 years of fighting, after hundreds of thousands dead on both sides, they both realized we are not actually achieving what we wanted to achieve. The gains are not big enough to convince us to continue fighting. Our treasuries are bankrupt. Our soldiers are angry. People are angry because they have lost loved ones and so on, and there is no end in sight. So we might as well put a stop to this. And we agree to cease fire, and we'll see. We'll rest for 10 years, and then if we need to go back fighting after 10 years, we'll go back fighting after 10 years. So sometimes you get agreements like that just war fatigue has happened. In the Ukraine-Russia war, for example, another thing which is coming out is, depopulation of Ukraine. I'm hearing that almost 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead, and another 150,000, 200,000 are severely wounded, that they can never come back to the battlefield. Ukraine's population before the war was, I think, around 38 million. It is probably now down to about 22 million. So where have these millions disappeared? They have probably left Ukraine and probably won't come back, at least not immediately. So it will be difficult for Ukraine to even sustain a war effort. Who's going to go and fight? Which is why you hear stories that they are physically kidnapping people from the road, from clubs, from theaters, from bars. Anybody who they can find, anybody who can be given 1 week training and sent to the front against the Russians, they're doing that. And now they are even recruiting women to send to the front. And imagine, if you give me a weapon to carry and give me 7 days of training, what would be the time I would last in front of a professional military force like the Russians? Probably less than 30 minutes. So you can send me to the front in 30 minutes, I'm a dead body, even though you have given me a weapon. So 7 days of training is nothing. You can hardly become a soldier in 7 days. But this is what's happening. And a time will come, a point will come when simply there won't be anybody left to fight anymore. And which is why I think a lot of people who understand war, they're saying that, look, if the Russians wanted to take over the whole of Ukraine, they could have done that long ago. It basically says that Putin is not interested in occupying Ukraine. He has two big conditions. Ukraine must be a neutral country, so must not join NATO. And number two, all these Nazi elements that are in Ukraine, they have to go. And Ukraine must have a clean government. And Ukraine must not do anything that will undermine the security of Russia. And the eastern part of Ukraine, which is basically Russian territory, the people there are Russian. Russia has already annexed. They have already taken that as part of Russia. So Russia's border has moved westward, probably all the way up to the Dnieper River in Ukraine. And the war may come to an end like that. There will be some kind of a final agreement. Ukraine will have to sign whatever conditions the Russians put in front of it. It will, technically, it's like a surrender, but it may not be called a surrender. It's a face-saving gesture. they would say, we agreed that Russia will have this area under control. The rest of Ukraine will be a neutral country. It will have, a fresh elections, new government. This government will not do anything. They'll probably have a guarantee not do anything that the Russians will see as a threat to their national security, etc., etc. And in return, Russia probably would promise a lot of economic assistance, rebuilding assistance. We will rebuild Ukraine. Blah blah blah. So conflict resolution often happens for number of reasons, number of circumstances. In the Middle East case, in the Israel-Palestine case, I think many of those conditions are absent. And the biggest absence is, I think, this question of trust. As long as Palestinian groups like Hamas and supporters like Hezbollah or Iran continue to say that, our goal is to completely destroy Israel, I don't see a big way forward in this. So first step, in my judgment, would be that the Muslim world accepts Israel's existence, and this is guaranteed to Israel in some ways. And then you can say to Israel, look, we have done our bit, now you do your bit. What are you going to do with that? Something like that. That's my personal opinion. And it's very easy for me to sit on a chair and say that. It's very hard given the ground realities.
Thank you so much, sir. In the interest of time, I think these are all the questions that we wanted to bother you with today. Thank you so much.
No bother at all. No bother at all. I enjoyed it, and I hope you got some useful, stuff from me. Something
Absolutely.
of use.
We got great insights from today's session. And just to let the audience know, sir has joined us from Australia all the way today. And once the session goes live, we would want you to send your questions as YouTube comments, send it to us on email. And we will also provide the speaker's email address in case you want to reach out to sir for any further questions.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
If people want to, follow me or join me on LinkedIn, most welcome.
Absolutely. We'll put all the credentials.
Look forward to talking with you again.
Yes, sir.